Hey everyone, it's Alexander Robinson. Welcome to the channel and welcome back to Double Feature Exploitation Month. 2 weeks ago, I reviewed the throwback film Grindhouse, which included Planet Terror from Robert Rodriguez and Death Proof from Quentin Tarantino. This week, I'm going to be talking about a more modern form of exploitation film. And for part 2 of this double feature retro review, I've decided to pick 2006's Crank and the 2009 sequel, Crank High Voltage. Both of them were written and directed by Mark Neveldine and Brian Taylor and star Jason Statham. Now, I have mentioned these movies a couple times on this channel, mainly when I review a new Jason Statham movie, and it's usually the sequel that I mention between the two. So now I finally get to review these movies, and I initially thought, should I just dedicate the whole month to Crank? But considering how close these movies are and the fact that they pretty much play out as one movie, I thought it best to just review both of them in one video. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'll kick things off with 2006's Crank, which stars Jason Statham as Chev Chelios, a hitman who overnight gets poisoned by a drug that will slowly kill him. However, the only thing that's keeping him alive, or at least slowing the effects of the poison down, is adrenaline. So in an effort to try to find the guy who poisoned him and hopefully the antidote, Chev Chelios needs to keep his adrenaline pumping throughout the entirety of this movie. That means he has to get in car chases, shootouts, have public sex. It's just a bonkers movie and a pretty bonkers idea at the end of the day. And that's what I really enjoyed about this movie. It just jumps right into its plot. The movie basically opens up with Chev Chelios watching a DVD from the guys who poisoned him, basically going, "Hey look, we're poisoning you. Haha, screw you, Chev Chelios." And then from that point on, it's just insanity throughout. The best way to describe this movie, it's basically the second best Grand Theft Auto movie adaptation, because it's this guy going around the entirety of Los Angeles, causing mayhem on the run, and it is so much fun. The absurd scenarios that Chev Chelios gets himself into are pretty spectacular. The one sequence in this movie that really sticks out to me in terms of how crazy this concept is when Chev Chelios is being chased by the cops, and he's on the phone with his doctor, Doc Miles, played by Dwight Yoakam, who basically is the exposition dumper. He tells Chev Chelios everything he needs to know about the drug, how to stop it or at least slow it down. And during this sequence, Chev Chelios is just casually driving this car through a shopping mall, miraculously not running people over, and he just crashes the car on one of the escalators. It really goes to show you that they didn't really take the concept that seriously, and the movie can make fun of itself at points and just say, screw it, we're having fun. And I think the action scenes are very well shot. They're graphic as hell, but they're non-stop entertaining. And part of the reason this movie is so entertaining is because of Jason Statham as Chev Chelios. He seems to be having a lot of fun in this role, and I love throughout this entire movie, he's just in a pissed off mood where he's just trying to find the guy who poisoned him, kill him, and possibly survive. The rest of the cast and characters are pretty fun as well. I already mentioned Dwight Yoakam as Doc Miles, and I just love how no matter what the scenario is, no matter how crazy things get, he has the answer to every problem. Amy Smart kind of has a thankless role in this movie as Chev Chelios' girlfriend. Probably the most memorable scene in this movie is the public sex that they have, which is so hilarious in the sense that Chev Chelios is having sex with his girlfriend to basically keep his adrenaline up, and everyone around them, rather than being shocked and horrified, they're cheering him on like, yeah, you two have that sex. And then later on in the movie, Amy Smart's character Eve gets the idea to basically give Chev Chelios head while he's driving and shooting at the bad guys. Again, playing into the idea that this is a Grand Theft Auto movie adaptation. Now, as much as I think Amy Smart is having fun in this role, I do have to admit that, like I said earlier, her role is pretty thankless, and this lends into a problem with this movie and especially its sequel. It's not very PC, because Amy Smart doesn't really have a whole lot to do in this movie outside of being the often helpless girlfriend, and the only time she's actually helpful is for sexual activity. Then you have Efren Ramirez, who played Pedro in Napoleon Dynamite. He shows up as this gay guy who is wearing a really tight shirt named Kalo, and he just plays this character as overly feminine and doesn't really do a whole lot. In fact, he's actually quite useless when Chev Chelios asks him to help out. And I know some people might look at that and go, oh, the gay guy is useless, which, yeah, that's not a good look for this movie at all. But I think the worst instance of this movie being not particularly PC is with the cab driver. Throughout a good chunk of this movie, Jason Statham is traveling from destination to destination in a cab, and he uses the same cab driver who is Middle Eastern. Once we get to the third time when Jason Statham needs to take this cab, the driver is like, no, you're not getting in my cab again. You have wet in my seats, you've gotten into a lot of trouble, I am not taking you anywhere. And Chev Chelios pretty much goes, alright, grabs the guy, throws him onto the floor, and just points at him and goes, Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda. And I'm like, oh my god, no. It's been a while since I've actually seen Crank 1, so I completely forgot that that was in the movie, and I thought, yeah, that doesn't work at all. That actually quite stings. So I can definitely see people not getting into this movie because of those certain aspects. But I think if you really embrace this for what it is, just a bug nuts insane action movie, then it can be pretty entertaining. Again, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and the way it really lays that message out is Chev Chelios and the bad guy are falling from a helicopter with one of the worst green screen effects I've ever seen, and Chev Chelios breaks the guy's neck and goes, well, I'm done. Let me call my girlfriend, tell her that I let her down again, and I'll embrace my death. And the movie ends with him crashing into a car in the middle of downtown LA, falls right in front of the camera, looks like he's dead, but right before it cuts to black, he blinks. And at that point, this is where we jump into Crank High Voltage from 2009, because this movie picks up exactly where Crank 1 left off. After he hits the ground, there's a van that pulls up, shovels him off the floor, and it turns out it's this group of Chinese guys who are connected to a character that helped Chev Chelios out in the first movie. And the plot to this one is that they remove his heart, replace it with an artificial heart, so Chev Chelios pretty much has to get his heart back, but the catch this time around is that he has to keep himself electrically charged so his mechanical heart doesn't crap out and he dies. And if you thought Crank 1 was crazy, let me tell you, you haven't seen anything until you've seen Crank High Voltage, because this movie is the best Grand Theft Auto adaptation. And when I say that in terms of these movies, I'm not talking about the story or characters. I'm talking about just going full-blown free roam, driving a car, being chased by the cops, and just trying to commit the longest rampage possible. That's what I mean by these movies are Grand Theft Auto adaptations. Whereas the first movie didn't take itself that seriously, there were a few sentimental moments throughout. Not here. No, this movie just embraces the insanity and doesn't even understand what the concept of sentimentality is. And there are several aspects this time around that actually heighten the insanity of this movie. The cinematography and editing are two of them, because the cinematography is quite interesting because they basically bought a bunch of cameras from Best Buy, so they could just get these cameras in car crashes, they could stick them in certain places that makes it easier to film, and they didn't have to worry about destroying industry level equipment. And the frenetic editing style of this movie is just bonkers. It's fast-paced, there are a lot of quick cuts, but you never get the impression that it's sloppily done. You're just like, yep, this fits with the tone of the movie. And another aspect of this movie that really helps is the music. I don't remember the guy who did the music for the first Crank, but in this movie it's Mike Patton, and his score is just insanity as well. There's a lot of great tunes. The score is so good that there's a point in the movie where Chev Chelios himself is whistling it. And it really fuels the adrenaline of this movie. In terms of this being an exploitation movie, or at least a more modern form of exploitation, This is that to 11 because there's so much drug use, there's violence galore, there's boobs, and there are just certain scenarios in this movie that feel more like the grindhouse movies back in the day, except with a modern flair. Chev Chelios once again does a great job in this role, and he is totally embracing the kind of ridiculous movie that this is. Amy Smart once again comes back, and I didn't think her role in this movie was as thankless as in the first Crank, because there's several moments in this movie where her character is just flat up snarky, and I kind of like that. Dwight Yoakam is back as Doc Miles, and the movie just suddenly decides he's a heart surgeon now. So yeah, there's a lot of moments in this movie where they just say, fuck it. Another example is when they bring back Efren Ramirez, who doesn't play Kalo in the first movie because Kalo was killed. Instead, he plays his twin brother, Venus, who's out to avenge his brother's death. And to be totally honest, this is what I think they should have done for Han in the Fast and Furious movies. What they should have done for F9 and Fast X was bring Sung Kang back, but not as Han, because we saw Han die in a way where there's no coming back from that. Just have him play Han's twin brother, and that way the Justice for Han slogan has more meaning, because like, okay, Han has a twin brother, he's going to avenge his brother's death and get Deckard Shaw. I'm on board. But nope, they had to go ahead and bring Han back to life, therefore retconning Furious 7, and based on what we saw in Fast X, with that scene between him and Deckard Shaw, they're buddies now, so there's no justice for Han. We got scammed in that. Okay, enough of that ranting. It's time to get back to the other Jason Statham movie I was talking about. Crank High Voltage is not a perfect movie by any means. And this is one of those scenarios where I say, if you like the first Crank, then you may enjoy this movie. But if you didn't like the first Crank, then don't bother, because all the issues that first movie had with being insensitive, this movie takes to an extra level. Especially considering that the movie involves the Chinese mafia. This movie is unapologetically insensitive towards the Chinese people, even to the point where it's borderline racially offensive, because you have Bai Ling in this movie, who plays a crackhead speaking in broken English, but throughout the entire movie, despite the fact that she's speaking English, they subtitle her dialogue, and I'm like, wow. Not to mention that she's also just flat out abused in this movie. I mean, she's obnoxious as hell to begin with, but like, she's just there as a punchline at the end of the day. And then you also have David Carradine in this movie playing the guy who got Chev Chelios' heart, a guy named Poon Dong. Yeah, David Carradine playing a guy named Poon Dong who looks like that. There's a part of me that wonders if Mark Neveldine and Brian Taylor were trying to make this movie as racially insensitive as possible, just to see what they could get away with. And I will say this, watching this movie now versus watching it 15 years ago, it certainly has soured, in my opinion, in terms of those topics itself. And then also the movie, it might be more insane than the first Crank, but I also feel like it's more mean-spirited. And that's why I say, if you like the first Crank, you may, emphasis on may, like this movie. Because the first Crank movie wasn't as mean-spirited. But, like I said with the first Crank, if you can embrace this for the insane bug nuts action movie that it is, then you'll have a lot of fun. I mean, yeah, there's some bad stuff in it, but ultimately I think both of these movies are worth a watch, which is why I'm saying both of them are good but not great. The best way to really experience this movie is get a bunch of your friends over, lots of beer, lots of weed, and just have a Crank double feature. Because with the right crowd, both of these movies are an absolute blast, and especially when you get to Crank 2, there are so many absurd moments that happen that you don't know how to think about it. For example, for no reason at all in Crank High Voltage, there's a sequence where Chev Chelios and the guy who he thinks has his heart hallucinate about being giant monsters in an electrical plant, and it plays out like a Godzilla sequence where you have this rubber mask of Jason Statham, and it's one of those things where it's like, it comes out of nowhere, it has no reason to be in the movie, but goddamn it, I love it. I love this sequence. That's my recommendation in terms of the Crank movies. If you can embrace these for what they are, they're a ton of fun, but if you gave the first Crank a shot and realized that it's not your thing, there's no reason to watch Crank High Voltage. But for me, both of them are really good, but highly problematic nowadays. And there you go, that's my review for Crank and Crank High Voltage, and this concludes Double Feature Exploitation Month. Next month, I'll be back to just 2 movies, and I decided to land on Schwarzenegger Month. There are so many Arnold Schwarzenegger movies that I haven't reviewed, but in line with my goal for this year of watching 1 movie a month that I have seen and then another that I haven't seen, I decided to pick 1985's Commando and 1982's Conan the Barbarian. I've seen Commando several times, but I've never seen Conan the Barbarian, so in 2 weeks, I'll start off with Commando, and then 2 weeks later, I'll finally watch Conan the Barbarian for the first time. But until then, I want to know what you guys think about the Crank movies. Whatever your opinions are, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell button to get notifications. If you want to find me elsewhere on YouTube, you can check out my theme park and travel channel, Alexander Robinson Travel Channel, and follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, Threads. I'll see you guys in the next video, but until then, have a good day, and take care of yourselves.